Was debating what to speak about. Should I just speak about the book that I've written? Should I speak about cooking? Should I speak about creativity? Should I speak about... and I decided that maybe in the true Indian sense of cooking, we will just take every single ingredient and make pav bhaji with it. So which is essentially what this talk is about. My talk is going to be titled, The Algorithms of Strategic Laziness. Okay. So this is going to be, I'm going to try and keep it provocative. I don't want these keynote speeches to be like, sort of puritanical. Here's what you need to do and so on. So I wanted to be slightly provocative and puritanical, not puritanical. So my quick introduction to myself, she already introduced me. So I head the digital workplace unit for Tata Consultancy Services. Typical corporate job, work with large companies, solve their employee experience and future of work kind of problems. And then this is my Spotify page where you can listen to my music. And again, while I was a trained Carnatic classical musician, self-taught cellist and a pianist and other things, and I sort of also use my school Sanskrit knowledge to translate heavy metal songs to Sanskrit, which is what you can hear on Spotify. And this is my book, published in 2020 by Penguin Random House. I wrote it during the pandemic when I did not have to commute to work. So I had 3 hours extra every day because, that's how long it takes to commute in Indian cities. So I set a target of about 3,000 words per day and wrote 65,000 words in about 6 weeks. And so that was Masala Lab. And then the columns, and then there is my blog, which has been around, internet memes, more music, and my Instagram, where I now have about 500,000 followers now. So the interesting thing is, the question I often get asked is that, how do you find the time? Right? So in order to answer that question, I kind of realized that I could then sort of give you this spiel about this myth of productivity. I hack my day, I do all these things, I use all these tools, I squeeze more time out of everything I do and so on. And that would be completely dishonest. Because that's not how creativity, and that's not how productivity actually works. Everybody who gives you productivity gyan is just doing after the fact theorizing and not really recognizing all the other things that go into it. So this is essentially my secret to being productive, is to be strategically lazy. When I was in university doing engineering, my electronics engineering professor once told me that a good engineer is a lazy engineer. He says that a lazy engineer will find ways to automate everything so that he or she can focus on the truly important human aspects of engineering. That human beings should not be wasting their time doing things that are repeatable and non-value adding, right? That a good engineer is a lazy engineer. And again, it's a principle that fundamentally has worked in my career as a software engineer, because software engineering is indeed the pinnacle of what it means to be lazy, which is you must not repeat code. You must not necessarily do everything. You must reuse other people's code. It's open source and so on, right? So in that sense, strategic laziness, see, there you go, right. So before I get down to strategic laziness, I want to tell you a small story from my early in the life. And I was 7 years old, and my father bought a Rubik's Cube for me. As generally as a way of seeing if this kid is above average smart or like generally middling. And soon enough, they were out for a while. When they came back, I had solved the Rubik's Cube. And my father immediately had, okay, this is IIT, this is Ivy League, this is Harvard, PhD. I mean, he was thinking, he had all these great thoughts. And then at some point of time, for some reason, I think my mother, who was a little bit more, more tuned into what I was, she said, how did you solve this Rubik's Cube? I said, it's simple. I changed the stickers around. Now, So the intent of that story is essentially, and over later in life, I really thought about that for a long time, right? So why is it that I'm the guy who changes stickers around, right? And then I realized that when we generally go about life, there's this notion of inferring the spirit of things, right? I mean, nobody told me as a child that that's exactly how you had to solve the Rubik's Cube. And I just found myself the most efficient, strategically lazy way to solve the Rubik's Cube. The instructions did not say explicitly that you're not allowed to remove the stickers. You're supposed to move the cube around, right? And so the interesting thing is that as children, we are fantastic at inferring the spirit of things and finding the spirit that works for us and not necessarily listening to what the spirit is supposed to be from the teachers, from parents, and so on. So this is inferring spirit, right? And then I think as we kind of grow older, as we kind of grow older, hold on a second, is it here? All right. Where do I have to point? Is it here? Okay, here you go. Yeah, so inferred spirit. As you kind of grow older, you start to realize that you can also infer rules. Right? The spirit is one thing, but inferring rules is an entirely different thing. The whole idea is that if you're someone who infers the spirit of things, you're a creative person. The more you infer the spirit of things, the more creative you are. But if you infer rules, you're a criminal. Right? So it's a very fine line between criminals and creative people in general is the point I'm trying to make. But the whole point is that I think one of the things that as we go forward into this sort of AI era, you're going to find that we need to let people infer the spirit of things far more than we do. Right? So that's one sort of thing. The second thing is the reason that I ended up taking software itself is that in general in India, we have a tendency to glorify what I call the jugad gaze, right? To glorify you. Every time you go, every newspaper will tell you, oh, look at this teacher, how she sort of so creative during the pandemic that she somehow found a way to teach her kids with this sort of setup, with the smartphone setup and so on, and how this very brilliantly creative vegetable seller is able to sort vegetables by size using two non-parallel lines, and this other lady who is grinding flour fresh from wheat while also working out and so on. Every single example of jugad is ultimately essentially a failure of society. In every single one of these cases, there's no way teachers should have to go through what she's going through. There is no way that growing agriculture or managing agriculture should be so bad that people have to do this. And the third thing is that Indians are so obsessed with this idea of fresh food that we will make the women in our families do anything to make fresh food 3 times. It should not be in the fridge. It has to be cut especially and so on. So this whole idea of jugad sometimes, we have to interrogate it not just as creativity, but also a failure of society in some sense. Now, one of the reasons I took up software as a career, despite being an electronics engineer, is essentially the fact that, and by the way, that's not me. I searched the internet for most ridiculous stock photo, and this was one of the candidates that came up. So the reason I did this was software was basically, in the 1990s and 2000s, the most amount of money for the least amount of work. And it still largely is. And again, it also has to do with the fact that strategic laziness plays a big role in how we think about software, right? And also, it was the only profession in the 2000s where you had a 5-day work week. Everybody else had to work 6 days. Now it's a lot more common. Okay. Now, but also more fascinatingly, it's this greater distinction between mankind has gone through a period where till the computer was invented, people needed artisanal skill. People needed specialized skills. And then the conveyor belt and Henry Ford and all of that essentially turned what was artisanal skill into a composable, mechanical, automatable skill, in a factory. And what the computer did is that it took every job and said, well, now you have computation. You can be a smarter, quicker person. You can calculate. Right? So the original term computer, before computers were there, referred to people who would make calculations manually. Right? It was manual computers who put Apollo 11 on the moon. Right? So computational thinking is the ability to take problems, break them down into smaller computable steps, decide which ones computers are good at, and then you do the rest, and together you're more productive and so on. But I would like to basically say that we are now in an era of what I call computational creativity, where for the first time, as all of you must be going through ChatGPT, you're going through all of these large language models and so on, this is a weird inflection point because for the first time, software is not something that only techie people like me will have access to. Computation is something that everyone will have access to. Children will have access to it. As soon as they are able to read, they're going to be able to use these tools. Right? So it's therefore, either you can see it as a massive threat or as a massive opportunity. Now, so let me explain what I mean by computational creativity with examples from my own experience in the last 10 years or so, right? Now, so the first example I'm going to take, so there's a famous sort of, if you've been to Florence or if you've seen this on the internet, the statue of David, absolutely stunning work of art by Michelangelo, right? And again, when Michelangelo was asked how he made the David, he's said to have said that, I look at a piece of marble, I remove all of the bits of marble that are not David, and then I'm left with David. Unfortunately, most of us on the planet cannot essentially do what Michelangelo did, right? On the other hand, here is what I can do though. I can do a YouTube search, I can search for YouTube on how to build David with Lego bricks, right? And given enough time and enough tutorials, most children can actually recreate the David with just Lego bricks, right? So I'll tell you why I'm sort of speaking about this in that sense is because we truly believe that we're in a world of creativity where creativity needs Lego bricks. Nobody is going to be a Michelangelo, right? And I'll take examples from my own experience with music itself, but creativity needs Lego bricks, and what these Lego bricks look like are going to be very, very different. Now, let me take some examples, right? So, my first example is essentially from the world of music. Most people think that both me and Anil Srinivasan here were all musicians, right? But of course, Anil was on another plane, prodigy, child prodigy, really was able to visualize music when he was very young, right? I'm not quite Anil Srinivasan, right? So for me, when I had to sit and compose music, what people don't realize is that this is what music production looks like today. It's not geniuses sitting in the room thinking of amazing ideas and just playing it live one shot. It's breaking music down like software into small parts that you can individually master. And by the way, use software to make a lot of corrections. Oh, you got the pitch wrong, we can correct that. You got the beat wrong, you can correct that. Right? So a lot of creativity today is a lot more software and computation augmented than we give it kind of credit for. And this, in a weird way, is true of almost everything now. Nobody writes software for anything from scratch. You go to GitHub, you take the best possible open source software, you start from there. Nobody is starting from a blank slate, right? Now, that was music and this was software. How about food? Okay. So a while back, people would often ask me, give me some recipe for a chutney. Give me this recipe for this kind of chutney, coconut chutney, mint chutney, and so on. So I said, why not use my software skills and my mental meta model of what a chutney is, and then create an algorithm that generates chutney recipes based on whatever ingredients you have. So, and this was done entirely with Google Sheets. So these are cooked ingredients, raw ingredients, nutty stuff, herbs, salt, acid, sweet, and tempering. You can pick whatever ingredients you want, or if you're lazy, just hit the generate button, and it will generate a recipe of a chutney for you, right? And again, the point I'm trying to make is that in this case, computational creativity is in really taking this idea of a meta model, meaning that a chutney is not just a work of art that somebody does, is able to sort of give you joy, but really a composable bit of knowledge that I can algorithmically break down and actually create any kind of chutney recipe that you kind of want. And you're going to start to see this everywhere. Another example is that I am also not an artist, right? I mean, I could draw, I had a reasonably decent handwriting, but I'm not necessarily an artist. I don't have any kind of practice. But again, I can use computational creativity to be far better than my skills would suggest. So this is me individually drawing these things, sketching them on pencil, and then scanning them into a computer, and then using AI to smoothen out the edges, and using software to color them using the right sort of color code, and then doing these infographics as someone who does not really know how to draw. These are all the infographics that I've drawn for columns in my book, and so on. So on the left is basically introduction to how you actually make a chutney. It's the same algorithm visually represented, right? Including the mixie that looks like an asura, right? Now, likewise, this is essentially a universal dal recipe generator, again, done with a little bit of software code. Now, and this is a universal algorithm for how to cook eggs. This is a simple explanation of how various kinds of coffee works. Again, all of this was entirely drawn and written by me with no drawing skills. Okay. Now, this is again how to make Indo-Chinese food and so on. So the point here is that the fundamental realization of my sort of 10-year or 15-year experience as a creative person across software, music, and cooking has basically taught me that these creativity Lego blocks, largely enabled by technology, if you will, the way you assemble them, they scale across disciplines. So how I think about cooking actually helps me be better at software. How I think about software actually helps me be a better cook and a musician, right? And so the whole point is that we sometimes tend to look at technology as something that dehumanizes creativity. It absolutely does not. I'll give you some light-hearted examples now. As part of researching my book, I first had to understand the sheer diversity of what Indian cooking meant, right? As somebody who grew up in Chennai, largely eating one kind of food, for me to write a book about Indian cooking, I had to understand every part of that. And there's no way. My publisher did not have the budget to send me everywhere to India, to allow me to eat everywhere and so on. Even my body would not have allowed that. So what I instead ended up doing is writing some software code to basically scrape the internet and download about 100,000 recipes from every part of India that I then analyzed to find out what common ingredients, what makes Andhra food, Andhra food. What makes Karnataka food, Karnataka food. And it turns out, amazingly enough, that it's just the starting choice of oil and the initial set of spices that define every cuisine in India. So if you take coconut oil and you add ginger, garlic, curry leaves, and cumin, it doesn't matter what you do after that, it will taste like Kerala food. You just swap that oil for mustard oil and use Panch Foran instead of any of those spices, doesn't matter, it's Bengali now. Right? And so the point is that, again, whole idea is that sometimes taking a big picture view was always, as the earlier speaker said, about philosophers. No. Software and computation and data can actually give you those insights, big picture insights, and that's essentially how I ended up sort of arriving at this. And on a lighter example, one very common thing I often get asked is that, how many whistles to cook dal in the pressure cooker is often a question I get asked. And by the way, I am the only person in this room who has read the instruction manual to a pressure cooker, because I don't think any of you do. But I'll tell you why none of you do. Because the answer is 3 whistles, it doesn't matter. Right? Where did 3 whistles come from? If you actually read the instruction manual, it says 1 whistle, lower the heat, and then measure time. Nobody does that. So what I did is I analyzed all of these 100,000 recipes, and I plotted a graph of every instance of 1 whistle, 2 whistles, 3 whistles, all the way up to 9 whistles. And I found that the graph peaked at 3 whistles. It essentially means that when a recipe writer has a doubt, it's 3 whistles, right? So that's basically how this sort of works, right? So now the interesting thing, I'll give you some more examples. This is a fantastic visualization by a person called Ashris, who does fantastic visualizations. His YouTube and Instagram is India in pixels, right? And he makes these fantastically insightful maps of India, okay? So this is the map of India, mapped in terms of how many people are vegetarian versus, eat meat, right? And you will find that the south and the east are predominantly meat eating, right? And the north and the west are predominantly vegetarian, or a lot more vegetarian than the south and the east. Again, this is pure geography. Fertile, large plains, large dairy cattle, so dairy is the primary source of protein. South and the east, not so many large plains, mostly seafood and poultry sort of eating. So this is one, and as you might interestingly note, you are currently located in the least vegetarian state in India. That's Telangana, right? So 1.3% only, right? So this is again, but a curious, very interesting thing also happens. Here's another map of how India orders food. So it turns out that there is a strong correlation between the previous map of where people are vegetarian and non-vegetarian versus whether people mostly order biryani or whether they order pizza. Right? And so it turns out these maps exactly line up. And again, it's also natural. So the biryani zone is the rice cultivating and growing part of India. And the wheat cultivating part of India tends to order pizza, which is obviously wheat-based, and so on. But here's the more deeper, interesting insight that you then, when you start looking at sociology and history and anthropology, here is a map by some researchers on what's called the patriarchy index. This is a range of factors related to women in education, infant mortality, maternal mortality, number of women, women's participation in the workforce, and a range of these things. And curiously enough, it also maps to the biryani pizza map and the veg non-veg map. And it so turns out that the south and the east, the rice-growing parts of India, essentially ended up liberating women before the wheat-growing parts of India. Because you know why? Because you can make rice in one shot, and the average South Indian person spends 1 hour in the kitchen, the average North Indian person spends 3 hours in the kitchen, because chapati is linear and you can't parallel process. But you can make 100 idlis at once, you can make rice at once, we can make biryani for the entire day. And not only that, the biryani improves in flavor the next day. Right? So the interesting thing is that, my point here is that a lot of creativity, people will tell you, is mysterious. It's art. It just happens. It happens when Anil Srinivasan live jams with Sikil Gurucharan. It happens on stage. You cannot possibly describe it. I would like to say that most creativity is craft masquerading as art, right? You know why cooking is considered an art? It's because our grandmothers and mothers do it for us. That's why it's art, right? Craft requires documentation. Craft is basically art that you can modularize, art that you can describe and teach someone else. You can only teach someone else the craft. Art is what emerges, right? So in that sense, I think what happens in the computational AI era is that more people now have access to the craft. And again, this is an example of one of those things that I did, inspired by a Malayalam movie with a very similar name, The Great Indian Kitchen. So this is the Great Indian Chicken algorithm as the most. So basically, this is a universal algorithm for how to make a chicken dish of every part of India, right? Depending on which part, how you marinate, whether you want to make a dry dish or a batter fry or a gravy. What's the universal gravy algorithm, whether you want to make a makhani or a white or a salan, or a OTM means onion, tomato, masala, which is the universal Indian thing. And then different kinds of tadka variations and spice mixes. Now, the point I'm trying to make is fundamentally that we're in a world where if I take the x-axis as specialization and y-axis as generalization, right? We're headed towards a world where most people historically started their careers in the bottom left. They're not very generalized, they're not very specialized. They're still early in their career, right? And sometimes people become deeply specialized. And again, there are some roles where I only want a specialist. I don't want my brain surgeon to be a generalist. I want my brain surgeon to be an absolute specialist and nothing else, right? But at the same time, you also have a lot of roles, careers in society that require high levels of generalization, things like marketing and sales and operations and human resources and design and so on. But increasingly, there is now a new category of career, which is the creative generalist, which is the top right. You're both specialized and generalized. Because you know why? Any specialization you want, you can learn in real time. Right? Like how I taught myself to draw, how I taught myself to compose music, how I taught myself to write a book. Every one of these skills is now democratized. So increasingly, things like software, things like computational biology, computational healthcare, personalized education, right? Every one of these things is going to be the role of a creative generalist, right? So this is the sort of new world that we're headed towards. Broadly, what happens is that you will find that all the things on the left are all things that human beings are good at. Framing, assessment, curation, synthesis, networks, right? Engagement and feedback, right? Everything else on the right. Unfortunately, a lot of education is us teaching all the stuff on the right, right? It's generation, ideation, challenges, analytics, adaptation, information and data and facts and refinement. This is where AI is going to get scarily good at. It's all the stuff on the left that we barely pay attention to, right? I mean, there's this famous saying that the engineers, unfortunately, the most famous expression in India is that every time you describe a problem, some old man will come and say, you do one thing. There's always a solution to every problem, but we often don't spend enough time asking the right questions, and framing and all of these things are fundamentally about asking the right questions. Then the AI will give you the right answer, right? So in that sense, I think this is where the world is kind of headed to. And I want to sort of leave you with some key bullet points, right? Learning to learn is the skill of the AI era, right? If it was artisanal skills before the Industrial Revolution, and then it was intellectual knowledge work in that period between that and the computing era, and the ability to be tech-savvy defined the computing era, learning to learn is literally the skill of the AI era, because every day you have to wake up with a creative dissatisfaction with the status quo that allows you to say, whatever skill I picked up for the last 15 years, probably irrelevant, right? So there are people who have 20 years of experience in retail designing how warehouses should be. All of their knowledge is now obsolete because the way you design a warehouse for a robot is very different, because you can actually throw things out at random because the robot does not have memory problems. And more importantly, the warehouse is designed deliberately randomly so that the robots don't collide with each other, right? Whereas human beings are generally good at avoiding collisions with each other and so on. So what will happen is that learning to learn, and therefore computational creativity, is going to be the sort of defining skill of the AI era. And interdisciplinary is now absolutely by default, right? So people think software is a separate discipline. It's not. Software is simply computational, right? You can be a computational biologist, you can be a computational musician, you can be a computational civil engineer. It doesn't matter. Now, computation, so interdisciplinary now is default, so people do have to be creative generalists. And more importantly, using AI to replace, augment, and extend. And these are three very different things. Replacement is being aware of what skill you have that AI is just unnaturally going to be good at, right? I think Professor Andrew McAfee from MIT once said that think about who is easier to replace, a plumber or an investment banker. And this was 10 years ago. The answer is investment banker. Investment banker does data analytics, which AI is far better at. 98% of all financial transactions are run by AI, not by human beings, already, right? So the point is that, again, what's easier to automate? Is it the radiologist or is it the nurse? AI has already become better at radiologists than early detection of cancer from the scans and MRIs and so on, but nurses cannot be replaced. Far more easier to replace a university professor, much, much harder to replace a kindergarten teacher, right? So what we'll kind of find is that what you can replace, where you can augment, and where you can extend is going to be a very crucial kind of skill. And last but not the least, I'll just say this. Occasionally, it's okay for kids to rearrange the stickers on the Rubik's Cube. Thank you.